We've already learned about the formalist school of criticism, which focused very tightly on the page itself.
And we've looked at reader response theory, which expanded the focus to the reader.
But while all this was going on,
and even before,
there was a huge revolution going on in another area of thought, the very new field of psychology.
Sigmund Freud, often called the Father of Psychoanalysis, believed that we are controlled by unconscious drives, and that those unconscious drives are developed in our childhoods.
He also believed that when there were conflicts between how we consciously perceive reality and the unconscious drives and the repressed desires and fears that we all bear,
bad things would happen.
Things like anxiety, neurotic behavior, depression, and self-destructive behavior.
Basically, according to Freud, we're all ticking time bombs.
We've all got this repressed anxiety and fear left over from our childhoods, and it affects the way we act all the way through the rest of our lives.
Freud was particularly interested in how early stressful experiences, such as toilet training, affected our personalities.
He believed that as we grow, the unconscious part of us develops into 3 distinct structures.
Now, remember, this is just the unconscious part. The conscious mind, according to Freud, is just the tiniest portion, the tip of the iceberg.
First to develop is the id. The id is all of our appetites and raw animal desires.
Hungry? Eat. Tired? Sleep. Angry? Hit.
That's the id. But when we're very young, we learn that not all of our desires are appropriate at all occasions. We learn that parents and others get upset with us if we don't say please, wait, and take our turn.
This is when the so-called superego develops.
Now, that doesn't mean super as in awesome or Superman. Super means above. Ego means I am.
The superego is the part of us that says, not now. That isn't polite. What would my parents think? It's what you might think of as your conscience. It wants you to do what is socially appropriate.
And if we have the superego, above I am.
Then we have to have the ego. I am.
It sits like a referee in between the id, which wants things, and the superego, which wants to deny things.
And many of our problems come when these 3 come into conflict.
Though many of Freud's ideas have been overturned by much more recent science, some of them are still useful today. For example, Freud described moments when our unconscious mind, specifically the resentments that might be built up in the id and the ego, breaks through and almost literally gets a word in edgewise, substituting what seems like an accidental word in a conversation that may actually,
and embarrassingly,
reveal our true feelings. This is most often called the Freudian Slip.
I actually read a funny one the other day. I was reading something about the 4 great mythological disasters that are supposed to end the world. The so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These 4 frightening figures are usually referred to as war, plague, famine, and death. Instead of famine, the writer had put down family as something that was going to end the world.
If Freud had heard that, he would have certainly wondered what about the writer's family was making him anxious. And there was that famous one from George Bush Sr. when he was running for office way back in the late 80s.
For 7.5 years, I've worked alongside President Reagan. We've had triumphs, made some mistakes, we've had some setbacks.
Now, I don't think Freud would have said that Bush was accidentally admitting to having sex with Ronald Reagan while he was Reagan's vice president.
Just maybe that he had a lot of sex on his mind.
Which, according to Freud, all of us do.
A typical Freudian analysis involves questions and answers more than anything else.
Freud's most famous patient, a woman identified as Anna O., called it the talking cure. The stereotypical image is of a patient lying on a couch while Dr. Freud sits nearby and says,
"Tell me about your mother." But speaking of questions and answers, the real question right now is,
how does all this relate to literature? And the answer is that Freud viewed writers and artists as no different from everyone else, carrying around this burden of repressed conflicts and desires.
he thought that it was possible to read literature as intensely personal, filled with hidden codes and symbols through which the writer was acting out his neuroses.
The most famous example of Freud's applying his ideas in this way is the idea of the Oedipus Complex.
You're not gonna like this one, which, by the way, comes from ancient Greece, but bear with us.
King Laius of Thebes was warned by the oracle that if he had a son, the boy would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother.
When he and his wife Jocasta had a child, they crippled the baby and sent a servant to leave it to die on a mountaintop.
The servant took mercy and gave the child to a shepherd.
A series of events led to the child being adopted by the king and queen of Corinth.
Years later, when the young Oedipus, whose name means swollen foot on account of the injuries he had from his birth parents, learned he had been adopted, he set out to find his own way in the world.
At a crossroads, he encountered a chariot driven by his birth father. The two had an argument about who had the right of way, and he killed the old man.
A while later, he encountered the Sphinx, who had been terrorizing the people of Thebes.
It asked him its riddle.
What walks on 4 legs in the morning
2 legs in the afternoon,
and 3 legs in the evening?
Surprisingly, the answer is not a trained circus bear.
We'll wait while you think about it.
Dum-de-dum.
4 legs in the morning,
2 legs in the afternoon.
3 legs in the evening.
It's a human being.
Crawling on all 4s in the morning of your life,
Moving on to 2 legs in the afternoon of your life.
and 3 in the evening when you're old and need a cane.
Oedipus gets the answer right, and the Sphinx throws itself off a cliff.
Because apparently, that's what sphinxes do when they're frustrated.
This freed the people of Thebes from the creature's terrible rule.
So when Oedipus got there and told them what he had done, they were very grateful.
So was their queen,
Oh, an older woman.
who was strangely compelling to Oedipus.
And suddenly, coincidentally, single.
They married.
Ew.
Eventually, Thebes suffered a terrible famine.
The oracle said it was because of a terrible crime.
Oedipus vowed to investigate.
And bit by bit, he found out the terrible truth.
His mother had had a son many years ago.
And given him up to be killed to avoid a horrible prophecy.
But the baby didn't die.
He grew up far away.
Came back.
Killed his father on the road.
And ended up marrying his mother.
Ooh! Ooh!
And, yes, they had children.
Double ooh. Right here.
Exactly what Oedipus must have thought. When he realized the truth, he put out his eyes and wandered off into the desert to die.
Now, to a formalist, the most important thing you need to understand in this story is all the delicious irony.
Couple tries to avoid a prophecy and thus causes it to come true.
King vows to find the root of the crime, causing a curse on his kingdom, and the root is him.
So, again, to them, it's all about the irony. To Freud, on the other hand, the irony is incidental. What's interesting about the story to Freud is what it represents about the psyche of the person who wrote it.
And the psyches of everyone else who kept retelling this story, finding it horrible and yet fascinating.
Remember, Freud's all about repressed conflict, particularly from childhood.
For Freud, this story is the root of what he called the Oedipus Complex, and it represents something deep in all of us.
Freud theorized that young children cling to their mothers as their first nurturer.
But at some point, they realize that their fathers have a connection to this nurturer that predates their own.
They have some dim awareness of the sexuality implicit in this connection, and find the whole thing threatening.
Essentially, they see the father as a rival for their mother's affections.
In a kind of vaguely unformed sexual sense, even.
Ew!
So, according to Freud, you all wanted to kill your fathers and marry your mothers at some stage.
And all of this neurosis got played out in a story written over 2,000 years ago.
See how far we've come since formalism? That was all, forget the author, forget the reader, just look at what's on the page.
But to Freud, the page is a way of figuring out the author's anxieties, neuroses, fears, secret desires, and childhood traumas.
He says that about dreams as well, that when you're asleep, your secret desires and all that creep out in dream symbolism and imagery.
Good luck sleeping tonight!
And say hi to your mom.